Hi everyone, welcome to the first of 3 videos on switches. In this video we're going to cover 3 basic types of switches, how those switches work from the inside out, and how you want to draw those switches on a schematic diagram. If you haven't already seen my video on schematics, I have a link in the description below for you to check out. Might be worth looking at that one before you go through this video. In the next video I'm going to talk about adding a switch to a circuit and why it might not be as straightforward as you would think. Now this is an interesting problem with a switch when we're trying to read the signal with an Arduino or any other kind of microcontroller or digital input. And we need to tackle that problem before we can actually use the switch. Now in the third video, we're going to talk about equivalent circuits to our switch and really dive into why that special circuit works, as well as a very simple algebra that lets us learn all sorts of things about the circuit. Before watching this third video, I would recommend watching my video on parallel and series circuits, which is also linked in the description. Okay, so first let's talk about the 3 kinds of switches. Now, a disclaimer here, there are a lot more switches that you can use for projects, and they do get a lot more complicated in form when you start looking at pulls and throws, but they're not any more complicated than how they actually work. So it's really just metal touching metal. Switches are not very complicated. It's just either allowing current to flow or not allowing the current to flow. Now, we're not going to cover a lot of the nomenclature here, but there are only a few things that you really need to understand for this: voltage, current, resistance, and the difference between closed circuits that actually lets electricity flow through and an open circuit that has a gap and doesn't let electricity flow. If you don't understand voltage, current, and resistance, check out my video on that, which is also linked. All right, so let's get into it. So we are going to talk about switches. Sweet. So here's the 3 main types of switches that we're going to look at, and we're going to look at what they are and why they work, how they work from the inside out. So the first one, let's talk about momentary switches. So here, momentary switch. This one is your typical push button switch. It has a little button on the top of it. And when you press that button down, it completes a circuit, allowing current to flow. When you release it, it doesn't complete the circuit. So it opens the circuit and does not allow current to flow. So if you look at them from the top, these ones are a little bit hard sometimes to understand how to plug in to a breadboard or how to put into your circuit. The easiest way to remember it is it looks kind of like an H here. So you have this rail right here on the top, if we're looking at it, and then this rail right here, and those are both connected to each other. So it's all one piece of metal right there. And then in the middle is where our real switching action happens. So that little button will complete that circuit or not complete that circuit. And this is kind of what it looks like from the inside. So we have this rail right here, which is equivalent to this one, and this rail right here, which is equivalent to that one. And then this little button is the same thing as this button right here, and we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, so this is kind of a hybrid view of it. You can see this piece of metal, and then this piece of metal. And remember, these make an H. So a lot of times, even when I'm plugging stuff in, I'll plug in a switch and I'll be like, oh, well, just for some reason when I press the switch, it doesn't do anything. Or the switch is always on. And that's because I confuse these things thinking that they're connected like this, in like a U shape. They are not. They are connected in parallel, or in this parallel line kind of thing. Parallel, you'll understand, is a little bit different of a word. No, these just make parallel lines, and there's kind of an H looking thing here, and when you press that button down, it connects across those, and then we can have current flowing through here. But if they aren't connected, then there is no path for current to flow. So we can't get current from this side over to this side because that button has not been pressed. Okay. Again, back down to this hybrid view here. This is our little push button. You can kind of see a schematic for a push button in there. And this is actually kind of how it works. So if I were to erase this little spring here, this is basically the schematic diagram, what you would write into a plan for a circuit that would show that this is a push button. And so this push button is what's called a normally open push button, which means that in its normal, natural state, it does not allow current to flow. So there is no physical connection between these two places, and say maybe this is our high potential side, or our plus V side, and then this is going to ground or whatever we're powering. There is no connection there. and that is the natural state of it. Now we could have one where its natural state is closed, meaning when you push it, it actually breaks the circuit. In this case, when you push this down, so we can take this little plunger thing, and if you push that down, it completes the circuit and allows a path for current to flow through here. So that is a normally open circuit. Again, normally closed is the opposite, where you would, and this is kind of how you would draw a normally closed circuit. So normally closed will look like this. It's kind of a poor representation there, but normally closed, you can imagine, looks like this. So by default, there's a path for current to flow through here. But then if you push that down, then all of a sudden that path disappears. No more place for current to flow directly through. So those are generally written as NO or NC. So NO equals normally open, and NC equals normally closed. I'm just going to write that like that. So yeah, you can kind of imagine this one has a little spring here, and when you press down on it, it momentarily, which gives us our name Momentary switch, completes that circuit. As soon as you release pressure, that spring will push it right back up, and then we have an open circuit again. So that is our momentary switch. That's for things like maybe on your remote. That's a momentary switch. When you push it, while you're holding down on it, it is completing a circuit, but as soon as you release, it's not completing that circuit anymore. And we can look for those signals and do different things with them. Next thing, latching switch. This is equivalent to like a light switch. When you turn a light switch on, you don't have to hold that light switch for that light switch to actually continue allowing electricity to run through it. And those are good for a lot of different things as well. So this is kind of how a momentary switch looks. Let's actually start with the schematic of it. So you can see we have here, where could current flow? Well, you can imagine that these are kind of connected here. I just kind of drew it poorly, but current could flow through here and then down through that lead. Now, if we took this white bar right here and we slid it over and instead connected these two, then current could flow maybe through this in some direction. And so the inside of the switch actually looks like this. And I have this written here. So maybe I have my positive voltage attached to the middle switch here. And then there's my slider up here, and you can see this purple spot kind of representing a piece of metal. And then each of these red ones are also metal leads. And that slider, if it's connected here and I have a positive voltage, then I have current that can run through here, through this piece of metal, and then down through that one. And maybe it powers an LED or something. Now, if I do that the opposite direction, and I took this whole slider here and I moved it over, then instead I would have a connection across these two here. And then current would flow this way through them, but it can't like jump the gap here, because there in that case there would be nothing attached to it. So it can't jump the gap, meaning this LED would be off, but then this LED would be on. So that's how a sustained switch or a latching switch works. There's a couple of different names for that one, but yeah. Next one is kind of a weird kind of combination of the two, and that's a tilt switch. So this one is literally a switch that, depending on the orientation that you have the switch in, it's either a closed circuit or an open circuit. Remember, closed being, yes, we can allow current to flow through, or an open circuit, meaning there's a gap. So tilt switch here, it looks like a little cylinder. This is a good representation of a tilt switch, and I generally in my diagrams I'll just put a little annotation there that says it's a tilt switch, so you know that that is how that switch functions. So in this case, you can see I have a little representation of a metal ball and then two little pads here. So let me kind of erase this a little bit. We're going to redraw it a little. So this is a metal ball, and then we have some pads that kind of look like this. And these are electrical contacts. So this red part is electrical, those wires that you would plug into something. All right, so this metal ball, if this metal ball is sitting down here and it's connecting those two things, then we have a closed circuit. And we can have current flowing through that metal ball and out the other lead. If that metal ball is not there and it's, say, up above there for some reason, maybe we've tilted this whole thing and the metal ball has rolled up to here and it's just sitting up in the top because we've tilted it sideways. Then there is no physical connection here between these two pieces. And so that means that we can't have current flowing, so that's an open circuit, and that's how that tilt switch works. All right, so that's been the first video on switches. There are a lot more complicated things. You can get into poles and throws and the number of switching states that you have on these different things. But really, this is going to give you a very good basic overview of kind of how switches work and kind of some main types. Generally, you're going to see a momentary and a latching switch. But in this case, you can also see kind of an in-between thing here, where this one could be considered a latching switch, because if it's sitting in one position for a long time, then it's going to stay in that state, whatever state it is. If you shake it around, then it's kind of like a momentary switch, where every time this metal ball contacts both of these pads, it'll send a signal, but as soon as it leaves, it's gonna release that signal, and it's gonna open the circuit again. Yeah. If you have questions, please send them to me. I will try and answer them as best I can. And thanks for watching this video on the first video of 3 on switches. So in the next video, we're going to talk about equivalent circuits. And actually, I think the next video we're going to talk about why you need a little bit of special stuff that you're going to add to this switch called pull up resistors or pull down resistors. In order to make one of these switches function in anything that's trying to read a signal. So look out for that video. Thanks.